Hi everyone, Adam here with Cold Open. We recorded this episode back in November. This is not like the other episodes that we are recording as part of our little explainer series, pre-season sort of thing, as we've been calling it. This is what we hope a real episode of the main series to be like. It's about Just Stop Oill, and I hope you enjoy. Sam, what do you know about Just Stop Oill?
I know very little about them. I just know them from occasionally popping up on the timeline, on the news feed, and causing a ruckus, mostly over in Europe.
I'm so glad that you phrased it that way, because I am going to start us out with a quote, which is from you. This is two texts that you sent me on the 19th of June, 5 months ago, as we are recording this. Do you want to read that for me?
Yeah, happy Juneteenth. Does the radical environmentalist in you cheer them on, or does the anthropologist/human being in you see them as wankers? Like, at this point, I feel like the petroleum companies are planting people within groups to do shit like this to turn people away from the movements.
Hello and welcome to Revolutions of Our Time, the podcast where we discuss protest and revolutionary movement, learning all about the theory and praxis that goes into them so that we might be better prepared to fight the good fight. My name is Adam.
And I'm Sam, and I've just been set up.
The quote that I got you to read, the text that I got you to read out, Sam, I'm sure you remember, not least because there was a link included in the original, was in reference to the Just Stop Oill protesters covering Stonehenge in orange paint as part of, or shortly before the solstice celebrations that happen there every summer. And we had a bit of a back and forth about that at the time, discussing its utility as a protest practice. But we'll come back to that in a little bit. First, I think it would be good to go through just a little bit of who Just Stop Oill is and what they want and what their sort of demands are.
Before we start, I think there are some shout-outs we need to make for some countries that have declared independence.
There are indeed. Not necessarily from Britain this time. The dates don't line up super well with British colonies, but I think there's three we want to shout out. We're recording this on the 16th of November, and on the 18th of November, an Independence Day is celebrated by Latvia, Morocco, and Oman from the USSR and German Empire, France and Spain, and Portugal, respectively. Wow, there's some messy geopolitics there, but congratulations to our comrades.
I mean, especially for me, shout out to Morocco in fighting the anti-imperialist fight that had been raging there for a very, very long time.
Mm-hmm.
But also shout out to Oman for being a bastion of peace, solidarity, and overall kind of doing their own thing in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. I would love to go to Oman someday, because I understand that, you know, they don't have these huge, like, modernist monstrosities, skyscrapers that other kind of Gulf states have, because there's, like, a building can't be taller than the mosque that's in the center of Muscat or something like that.
From what I understand, they still have a lot of oil money. They just choose to put it back into society and the people and preserving their culture, which is not can be said of some other countries in the area. And I also would like to visit one day.
Yeah, that's very true. Also, their Independence Day from Portugal, they gained independence in 1650. That's some, like, first out the door Independence Day stuff. That's great. So, back to the topic at hand. There's less history to go through this week with Just Stop Oill, because it's a newer protest movement. Just Stop Oill has a very specific aim. They want to end new licensing for and production of fossil fuels in the UK. I found it's hard to pinpoint a date exactly when they were founded. There is an article, I believe, The Times, which puts it at February 2022, though I did find a mention of them as early as October 2021. But It's hard to know the precise date when it was founded. It's not listed online or anything like that. They employ a variety of tactics to try and achieve this, including civil resistance, direct action, traffic obstruction, and vandalism. And I suppose those last two are what they are best known for. I think that the first time I heard of them was when they threw a can of soup at Vincent van Gogh's sunflowers, and they received some pretty negative media attention for that. Do you remember this happening?
I wasn't aware that they were that new. I feel like it's because you've been in the know about them since pretty early on and have been sending me stuff like that. I don't remember that specific instance, but on the timeline of climate change awareness, I mean, we all know that Al Gore invented climate change not too long before that. It's a joke, people. That's a joke. But
yeah, to sell books to people in California.
Yeah, exactly. And Massachusetts. Don't forget them. But I think the timeline is a bit relevant in that global climate change awareness is still a very, very new concept. So to them being founded so recently and new groups forming all the time, especially with the severity of climate change, is not surprising.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that new groups coming out of each other in that way, because it's not really possible to talk about Just Stop Oil and their origins and tactics without also talking about two other protest groups. They directly came out of a group called Insulate Britain, who kind of was the first group in recent times to gain a lot of attention for blocking motorway traffic. And their goal was to get the government to commit to insulating all social housing in Britain by 2025 and have a planning to retrofit all British homes by 2030 as a way of both limiting the carbon emissions that come from largely gas boilers that exist in the UK, as well as, of course, stopping people from going cold in the winter, right? Like, if you are a poorer person, you're less likely to have an insulated home, and so your bill for heating in the winter is going to be more. You're less able to afford it. It's a common example of poverty charging interest.
Oh, absolutely. I guess that was a big culture shock for me when I moved to the UK from California, was realizing that a 3-bed house being advertised for rent that was a lot cheaper than a newer 1-bed apartment was that way because you're going to be paying twice as much as the rent on your heating bill in the winter in an old house.
Yeah, old houses in particular have like single glazed windows and they retain heat very, very poorly. And Insulate Britain itself emerged out of Extinction Rebellion. Extinction Rebellion was founded in 2018 by Gail Bradbrook and Roger Hallam and a few other people, but those are the two who get talked about in the media the most. And for me, the founding of Extinction Rebellion, their entry into the kind of zeitgeist, was a big moment for me. I remember when they first started claiming headlines in the UK for blocking traffic and things like that in 2019, because they started talking about their actions in a way that I found very compelling in relationship to climate change, which is invoking the idea of the social contract. What do you know about the social contract, Sam?
The social contract, I think, can be explored on several different levels or from several different perspectives. Essentially, what I know it as is the agreement by the masses to be ruled over as long as the government is doing their job to protect them, to make sure that society functions, and if there is, some corruption taken off the top, well, that's just seen as an acceptable result of this contract being fulfilled. I've also heard it referred to for like celebrity culture, like celebrities are stalked and don't have any privacy, but they are also very wealthy and have a lot of fame, so that is the contract they kind of have signed with society. I don't necessarily agree with that, but that's another context I've heard the social contract be discussed in.
Interesting. I hadn't heard it be mentioned in that framework before, but I see how that works for sure. Yeah, you're spot on. It's an idea that goes back to John Locke, Enlightenment philosopher who wrote a book called Leviathan. After the English Civil War, he was like, "Oh, this was not great. We need to keep peaceful, so let's do what the sovereign says, as long as he," and it was of course a he at the time, "would protect us." But the idea is, of course, that governments have responsibility as a part of the social contract, and whether in a practical sense that's how it works, certainly in an ideological sense, this is the basis of Western governments, is the idea of a social contract. So the claims from Extinction Rebellion were that this contract has been broken. And I want to send you a quote from Extinction Rebellion's Declaration of Rebellion to explore that idea.
"We hereby declare the bonds of the social contract to be null and void, which the government has rendered invalid by its continuing failure to act appropriately. We call upon every principled and peaceful citizen to rise with us."
I found this a very compelling idea because I think that it indicates how I felt about government inaction on climate change. It's a very important issue to all of us, but it's something that I, on a personal level, have been passionate about for a very long time. When I was maybe 8 or 9 years old and I first learned about climate change, back when the whole imagery of climate change was around polar bears rather than human people, which you don't see polar bears anymore.
That's because they drowned. They already drowned.
Jesus. A lot of them, yeah. But I would go around my house switching off all the lights. It would drive my mum insane just because I would be sitting in the dark because I'd switch the lights off. But I think that it spoke to how I felt about it. And I also think that it spoke to how I felt in 2020, particularly after the murder of George Floyd and the kind of unrest that happened, especially in the United States. But as an idea of the social contract being broken, right? Like black people, especially in the States, are not protected by the state in many ways. And I think that there's various instances where this applies.
Yeah, I think the social contract grows ever thinner as the years go on. I think that's essentially what is driving us to make a podcast like this, just average people trying to make our voices heard and trying to inspire others to know their place in society. Because you look at every aspect, economically, militarily around the world, what the West is doing, it seems like the social contract is ripping apart, if you believe in the ideology of it.
Yeah, I think that's very true, and I do think that's part of why we're doing what we're doing here. Extinction Rebellion made headlines because they weren't just doing marches, they weren't just standing on Parliament Square with some signs, they were blocking traffic. They shut down whole roads in central London in 2019. I was lucky enough to be a part of that one day. I remember I actually slept in my sleeping bag at Marble Arch, which was great fun. But they were very unpopular. A YouGov poll found that 56% of British people had a strongly or somewhat negative view of Extinction Rebellion, and only 36% had a strongly or somewhat positive view of the group. Insulate Britain, who emerged with the same founders, especially Roger Hallam. You don't hear so much about Gail Bradbrook in terms of Insulate Britain and Just Stop Oill, but they started making headlines because they blocked motorways and the port of Dover starting in September 2021, their final road blockade being in November of that year. And a YouGov poll found that 72% of people in Britain opposed their actions, 18% were unsure how to feel about them, and only 10% supported their actions.
If we're still talking about the social contract, I think a lack of class consciousness and a privilege in some groups in society, they might view these people as breaking the social contract, right?
Yeah.
That they don't see the government as doing it, and they see these people who are blocking their commute to work or blocking their deliveries to be in breach of that, not the government themselves.
I think that's true. I also wonder whether there's something particularly British about this. Like, deeply ingrained in sort of the British social psyche is the idea of not making a fuss, having a stiff upper lip. And I wonder whether seeing people publicly make a fuss in this way is particularly egregious in Britain. I don't know whether that's true, but I feel like in France, for example, this wouldn't be as headline grabbing as it perhaps is.
That is just called a protest in France.
In February 2022, Insulate Britain announced that the protests had failed. Many protesters were arrested for blocking a motorway. But from the group emerged Just Stop Oil. As I say, it's a bit blurry as to when they were founded, but it was founded by 6 individuals out of Insulate Britain. The only one who the press ever seems to talk about is Roger Hallam, one of the founders of Extinction Rebellion. Just as he was co-founding Extinction Rebellion, he was working on a PhD at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in central London, about non-violent protest movements. And his argument for his thesis was that anytime a non-violent protest movement has received the support of 3% of the population, it has always succeeded. That has been criticised. Andreas Malm, in particular, in How to Blow Up a Pipeline, was very critical of that, pointing out that he ignores conveniently a lot of the violent aspects of the same protest movements. But that's a topic for a different time. We're going to focus on the tactics here, which very self-consciously revolve around non-violent disruption. Just Stop Oil, they are known for demonstrating at artistic and cultural events and locations. Their big thing, as I said at the top, was throwing tomato soup on Van Gogh's sunflowers. They got a lot of attention for disrupting the Central Court at Wimbledon during, I think it was this summer, might have been last summer, and of course Stonehenge in the summer of 2024. And I want to spend some time talking about Stonehenge, in part because this was when you contacted me about them, and also because it seems like kind of an odd target, right? Like, this is an ancient monument. It's 5-ish thousand years old. The Celts who built it had nothing to do with climate change.
I like this as a discussion as well, because as leftist as I am still have a master's in history and was inspired to pursue that as a young lad by the whole Indiana Jones, like, it belongs in a museum sort of trope. And I consistently have mixed feelings about certain museums and certain ways of preserving things. Mm-hmm. And I think also with Stonehenge, especially before the solstice, there are a lot of like druid hippy dippy types as well. It does not seem like the target that would be a big monolith of the British government. But I like this discussion. I like this discussion because it gives you a chance to pitch to me and hopefully some other listeners maybe another perspective, and hopefully I can change my mind, because I don't necessarily have strong opinions on these movements, or am more on the fence, I suppose. So it gives you an opportunity to, I guess, convince me in real time of the validity.
Well, I would say temper your expectations a little bit, because I'm not convinced myself. I do think that there is validity to it, but I think that perhaps there are elements which also have to be present that maybe are not. But we'll get to that in a sec. So a few things to bear in mind about the pouring of red paint on Stonehenge. If you haven't seen this clip, then that's basically what it is. Stonehenge has a fence that's some distance around it, and when you visit, you kind of walk around the fence. It's a little bit disappointing, to be honest with you, because there's a road that goes straight by, and you can see it just as easily from the road as you can by paying the £25 or whatever to get in and walk around.
Well, they only started charging a few decades ago, if I recall correctly. It used to be just that thing you'd stop at driving from the West Country to London.
Very true. These protesters snuck under the barrier. It's one little rope. They went under the barrier, threw some orange paint at it, and then were taken away by security and then the police. I think it's important to remember that the paint that was used was cornflower based. It wasn't damaging to the stones. It was blown off the next day with like some compressed air thing, but it would have come off anyway when it rained. Just Stop Oil have conducted actions which have more directly targeted fossil fuel infrastructure. This was one of the points of criticism you put to me in June, which was that surely their energy would be better spent targeting these oil companies. But they've done that. In 2022, Just Stop Oil blockaded 10 critical oil facilities across the UK for several days, slowing things down, getting in the way, being disruptive. But that didn't make the news. No one really heard about that. It wasn't something that people were that interested in. I also think it's important to bear in mind that, as you say, they only started charging entry to it in the past couple of decades. When my mum was a kid in the late 70s, early 80s, not that long ago, there was no barrier to Stonehenge. You could just walk right up to it and like touch the stones, and people would chip little bits of the rock off as a souvenir. People often did. So that's, more destructive, not that long ago. And finally, which is the point from Just Stop Oill themselves, which is that the level of outrage that we feel about a immediate but superficial vandalism of this ancient artifact does not reflect the level of outrage that we feel about the ongoing destruction of the natural world and indeed our cultural heritage sites as humanity through government inaction on climate change and the corporations that sort of spur it on as part of their daily business practices. So I want to hear your thoughts on a question that I have for you, and then we'll go into a quote and explore maybe if your mind might be changed about it a little bit. Basically, what do you think about defacing works of art and culture as a tactic within protest movements? What is your sort of gut reaction to that? How do maybe people in your life think about it? I'm curious for your thoughts.
I think you've kind of sold me a bit in that explanation itself, which might show how little I have sort of thought about this stuff. Because you're right that we get very outraged at heritage being defaced because it's finite, right? You can't take something from thousands or hundreds of years ago and replace it. But you're right in that we're doing that to the earth constantly, and we also can't replace that. I think as a wider, would I appreciate them doing this all over the world to cultural heritage sites? Not particularly, but I get the point, and especially if it's not actually doing that damage. If they were going around explicitly damaging things, I think I might have a different perspective, but I think just using it as a tool to show the, I guess, hypocrisy of society, I think it actually is quite effective when it's put that way. But obviously when we see that in the news, that is not explained at all.
Yeah, and I think that is part of the problem, right? Which is that we don't have this sort of level of analysis that people do, and that's something that a question that maybe I'll bring up now because I was going to talk about it later, but I think is worth talking about. The question is, as you say, right, when you have that explained to you and you think about it and you do some analysis, it starts to seem like a much more reasonable tactic, a much more reasonable position. Do you think it's fair to expect that of the general public, people who have their lives to live, who maybe don't have the capacity or framework or time to engage with these ideas on this level? Do you think that is a reasonable expectation of protest groups, or do you think it's a practical expectation of protest groups? And if not, what should we do instead?
I think it would be reasonable if the channels of communication to the public weren't currently compromised by the society we live in. We've talked about the social contract. I think the news, like journalism in general, there's some very good journalism around the world still, but I think journalists and media have by and large broken the social contract of holding the powers to account, whereas they have been bought by the powers. You know, Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. You know, billionaires consistently buy newspapers for good reason, because then they can control the narrative.
Or social media platforms.
Exactly. So I think that if the news was doing the job it's intended to do, then they could unpackage this for the everyday person. But as it stands, they are serving as a mouthpiece, by and large, for these large companies that are contributing to climate change or governments themselves. I know I have a very different view of BBC News than a lot of left-leaning British people I know, and that's because I mostly have always gotten their global news, which is quite good reporting because they don't have any skin in the game generally in stuff going on the other side of the world necessarily. But then when it comes to reporting in Britain, they have lost a lot of trust within the British public.
On the responsibility of the news, that sets me up quite well for the next quote that I would like you to read. It's a bit of a longer one. It's from James O'Brien, the left-leaning radio host on LBC.
I see him pop up on my TikTok a lot. I had no idea who he was before the elections, but now he's in my he's in my algorithm.
He's in the algorithm. He's got some good takes. He's an interesting guy. And this is a quote from him from just 2 weeks ago.
All roads lead back to climate change. I have in recent years been a little bit guilty. I think the snooker one did me. When they threw orange powder on the crucible in the middle of the World Championships, I sort of thought, ugh, I understand why you're doing this, but for heaven's sake, this isn't working. And then I look at the scenes in Spain. The equivalent of an entire year's worth of rain fell in 8 hours, and you kind of think, we're never going to stop, are we? We're never going to do it. Spain could have spent over the last 10 years on measures that would have massively mitigated the reality that they're facing this week. If they protest in a way that means no camera crews will turn up, no journalists will turn up, no newspapers will report it the following morning, then that's fine. They won't go to jail. But if they report it in a way that gets noticed, they go to jail.
How does that sit with you? What thoughts emerge from having read that?
I think he's right. I think I only noticed because of Stonehenge, because I care about cultural heritage, I care about history, and I was upset initially. My gut reaction was to be upset at these kids that had no respect for it, right? But you mentioned that they'd been protesting against oil companies years previously, and I hadn't heard about that at all. So it only came to my attention when they did something I cared about. Did I know that they did the snooker world championships? No, I didn't know that either, because I don't care about that.
I didn't know that one until he mentioned it either, because I also don't really care about that.
There are some 50-year-old British men that were very upset about that one.
It's true, and you've seen it at football matches. Wimbledon was a big one. I think that this is an interesting quote in that I think that it is rare, especially in the UK, which has pretty centrist media, pretty socially conservative, not in socially conservative in an American sense where you don't want people to have abortions, but sort of socially conservative in the sense where you think people to be prim and proper and sort of not make a fuss.
No boobs on TV until after 9.
Yeah, exactly. Socially conservative. But I think that James O'Brien is a fairly popular journalist, and that him speaking out in this way on a more mainstream radio show is really beneficial. When it comes to arts and culture, I also think that it's important to remember that Just Stop Oil are not working from scratch. In November last year, Just Stop Oil protesters broke the glass on Diego Velázquez's Rokeby Venus. And this may not have been clear from the Van Gogh vandalism when we were talking about it before, but when in a gallery, big paintings, famous paintings, really all paintings, will have a very thin layer of protective glass over the front of them. You can't see it when you go to visit the paintings, but that's there for any sort of reason, really. Events like this, dust, maybe someone just trips and spills a coffee, that's what it's there for. But these protesters broke this glass, and this is not the first time that this painting has been targeted by a protest movement. In 1914, suffragette Mary Richardson attempted to slash the most beautiful woman in mythological history, the Venus of this painting, when it was hanging at the National Gallery in London. Just Stop Oil very self-consciously draw on the tactics of the suffragettes, but as opposed to the suffragettes, they are consciously non-violent. The suffragettes had an arson campaign, they burned down cricket pavilions, golf clubs, other cultural institutions, they threw bombs at various things. I believe it's Emily Pankhurst famously disrupted Epsom, big horse race in the UK, kind of the Kentucky Derby in the US, kind of a similar thing to that.
Is she the one that threw herself in front of the king's horse?
Yeah.
I think that's a moment that pops up quite often when talking about suffragette movements and their extremism, essentially, but they're viewed very well in the historical lens. No one is looking at those images and saying that their cause was unjust.
I also, just as a correction, Emily Pankhurst was a big person in the suffragette movement. There was an Emily Davidson who did all of that stuff, which is the confusion there. But yeah, they're praised, and to that point, when Just Stop Oill stormed the Central Court at Wimbledon, Suella Braverman, who was the Home Secretary of the UK at the time, that position is often called Minister of the Interior in other countries, Secretary of the Interior in the US, very senior government position. She called their Wimbledon protests selfish, to which Just Stop Oill responded by quoting a speech from Suella Braverman that she did at a high school in Portsmouth, where she said, "Always remember the suffragettes gave you the right to vote." Previously, the Home Secretary before her, Priti Patel, said that climate activists were selfish, fanatical, and frankly dangerous, but she has also complimented the suffragettes for fighting for women to get the vote. So this leads to a couple of questions, I think. One is, does knowing that the suffragettes used the same tactics as Just Stop Oill, to the extent where they targeted the same paintings, does this affect how you feel about Just Stop Oill protesters? And I know this may be loaded, given your interest and love of history, but do you think in general that has an impact for people?
I'll say again, it belongs in a museum. No, but it does give it more legitimacy in my mind. And I think I only know of a lot of suffragette tactics because I teach it. I've had to dig through and find more specific things like that aren't necessarily present in a standard curriculum. But I think as a society, not coincidentally, we've left that part of the suffragette movement out of the popular history, right? You might hear the one story about the woman who bravely threw herself in front of the king's horse to garner attention, but that's it. You don't hear about all the other instances very often. So it does give them more legitimacy in my mind, and it does highlight the severity of the issue of climate change and how urgent it is.
I think so. And I suppose it leads to another question, which is, I guess, a broader question than this podcast, which is around the validity of various tactics in itself, which is, what can be vindicated by history? Is the answer anything, given the right circumstances? And I ask this because, particularly at the moment in my algorithm, particularly on Instagram, I've been seeing a lot of posts about protest movements, been involved in a lot of protests recently in and around Amsterdam, and this idea that's come up a few times, and I wanted to find a quote for this podcast, but I couldn't find a specific enough example, which is saying that basically, as the left, and particularly in the wake of the re-election of Donald Trump and the ascendancy of conservative nationalist movements globally, one of the things that we need as an organized political body is to be less critical of specific tactics that other leftist groups use. We can, in our back rooms, whatever, discuss what tactics we want to use, but in general, whenever this happens, we have to kind of support that for the cause and recognize that a multiplicity of tactics are beneficial for achieving our aims.
You are completely correct. I think a big critique of the left in general right now is that, and I've mentioned this before, that leftists would rather fight with other leftists than combat right-wing thought. And we've seen that contributed to a huge part of right-wing elections in recent years and in recent months. You don't have the right wing in a lot of these countries going after each other, even though they're moderate right, and then there are extreme Nazi right.
Yeah.
And they still don't really critique each other because they're on the same side. And you don't see that sort of solidarity on the left. You have the moderate left who just calls the leftists too extreme. And then you have the extreme leftists that criticize each other's little tactics. They nitpick here and there. Again, they would rather fight with other leftists.
Yeah, I think that is very much the case. A friend was observing that a right-wing commentator had pointed out how the left can never agree. They're just, arguing with each other. It's like, yeah, there's nothing more left-wing than hating other leftists. That's which I think can be potentially. I think debate has to be an important part of any movement, but I do think that it is often taken too far and too publicly as well. I think that's often for back channel discussions.
Well, I think if just as a historical example, if Lenin and all of his colleagues had been infighting before the revolution even started, then they wouldn't have gotten there in the first place. Even Mao, Mao, who I'm not a big fan of necessarily, Mao and his enemies, the nationalists in China, got together to face a common goal of kicking the Japanese out. Yeah. And then once that was done, then they had their civil war. But first, let's deal with the first problem.
Yeah. I don't have a super clean segue for this, but I think it's interesting to briefly discuss, and particularly in that context, the structure of these groups. I'm not intimately familiar with the structure of various protest groups around the world. That's something I hope to learn more about through doing this podcast. But briefly, this is how Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oill are organized. There is a central organizing body, the central group, usually in London, because everything in the UK is centered on London. And they will issue some basic principles, guidelines, goals, etc. And that's kind of the broad identity of the movement. Then, in different parts of the country, specifically in a UK context, although Extinction Rebellion is increasingly international and very self-consciously trying not to be centered on the UK. But these groups will establish themselves in all different cities, all different towns. The central group might provide some, or individuals within that group might provide some training, offer coordination for national scale events, but most of the actions are done through these local affinity groups. And there can be some big changes that come out of these. For example, Extinction Rebellion started with 3 demands. This was tell the truth about the climate crisis from the government, to act now, which meant net zero carbon emissions by 2025. When this demand was issued in 2018, that seemed like an achievable, if ambitious, aim. Now it feels a bit quaint. The third goal was to decide together. The idea was that the government should form a citizens' assembly on climate and ecological justice to guide climate policy going forward. And this was, for the first few years, that was the 3 demands. Then a 4th demand was created. The earliest I could find was from Extinction Rebellion Liverpool. I believe they were the initiators of this. And they added the 4th demand, which was the green transition should prioritise the needs of those who have been impacted by the colonial capitalist framework that went into creating the climate crisis in the first place. Many other places have adopted this 4th demand. It had a big impact. So then I suppose, what do you think about the structure of these protest groups as a tactical creation? Because on the one hand, decentralization is more democratic, but perhaps also more directionless. Extinction Rebellion was, I believe, in 2019, 2019, criticised for blocking a tube station in Canning Town, stopping the metro there. But there's a few things to unpack with that. One, it was done by a local affinity group. The rest of the movement largely condemned it, actually, but had no power to stop it, right? Blocking public transport seems antithetical to the organization's goals. Maybe there's something there. But also, and I don't think this is directly relevant, but I do think it is interesting to observe, as an Extinction Rebellion organizer pointed out to me, Extinction Rebellion blocked buses all the time by stopping in the road, stop buses from getting through. But that received much less criticism, and she made the argument that it was because it's poorer people who take the bus, whereas richer people go to Canning Town, especially with its proximity to Canary Wharf, which is one of the banking districts of London. So yeah, what do you think about this as a structure? This decentralized structure that is very democratic, very grassroots, but at the same time is harder to coordinate in a specific direction.
I am all for a collective movement and a democratic movement, but when it comes to strategy, I think that having maybe an elected or selected by democratic means group at the top to be definitive and to break up infighting within is vital. I think there needs to be orders coming from somewhere. Maybe there's a hierarchy to where, if the head gets cut off, it doesn't kill the whole movement. But I do think that you need someone to be the one making the judgment calls and setting up the ideals and the rules, essentially, that you are going to play by. Because I do appreciate the collectiveness, but I do see progress within a movement being spearheaded by by a few at the top. And I think we've seen examples of that in history. I say that because of my sense of history and seeing movements that have succeeded having very strong leadership at the top.
The role of the charismatic leader in protest and revolutionary movements, I think, is very interesting. I wrote an essay about this at university once, particularly the way that the authority of the charismatic leader is passed on to their successor, the legitimization of charisma or the institutionalization of charisma. I think that that is useful on the one hand because, as you say, can coordinate. You can have this person making these judgment calls. I think it's symbolically important as well. Not important, but necessarily, but symbolically powerful. But I also think that that does open the door for corruption, for the hijacking of a movement for other purposes, because if authority is centered in, or even seen to be centered in, this one person, this one position, then I think that that attracts people who are primarily interested in power.
Sure.
Maybe this is too far down the road as compared to an environmental group, but I do think it's something to be aware of.
And I'm not saying it can't be done to be doing it at a decentralized level. I'm just saying that historically, even in the contemporary era, groups that have succeeded do tend to have these leaders. I mean, look at Anonymous now.
Yeah.
Sometimes they do some very big stuff, but the way they're structured, you can't even tell if it was them necessarily. And I think maybe their message and what they're fighting for would be more clear if they did have some leadership, although it is understandable why they don't have any. But they're a cause I see that consistently comes up in the now that is leaderless and therefore directionless at times.
As an aside, Anonymous started doing protests in central Amsterdam recently, Dam Square. They call themselves Anonymous for the Voiceless, and they would stand there with the masks in their display, and I was like, "Ooh, what's this about?" And they were vegan activists, actually. They wanted to stop the factory farming, which is not Anonymous's usual MO. I know there's no leadership structure there, so anyone can kind of claim the identity, but I thought that was interesting.
For all of you interested ladies out there, there's no better way to get Adam's attention than by standing in a square protesting something.
It's annoying how accurate that is. Let's share a few thoughts to kind of wrap up here and conclude. And something that I think is important to note, specifically in regards to environmental movements. We've spoken about Just Stop Oill, Extinction Rebellion, Insulate Britain. And these are movements, groups that garner a lot of headlines, and they are useful in the sense that they are based in these Euro-American cultures. Anyone who's listening to this is likely to also be from that space, and it's the kind of thing that they can get involved with. But I do just want to give a shout-out, credit to the most effective environmental protesters, which are indigenous groups, and they also have the biggest risk in doing that. Every year, more than 100 environmental activists are killed. A Guardian article from 2023 reported that in 2022, environmental activists were killed at a rate of one every other day. Indigenous figures are disproportionately represented in this. They account for 34% of all murders, despite being 5% of the global population. Between 2012 and 2022, at least 1,910 environmental defenders were murdered. And the stakes are lower here in Europe, for sure. After blocking a motorway in the spring, Roger Hallam, one of the maybe charismatic leaders of Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oill, he wouldn't like to see himself as a leader because of the consciously decentralized nature of these organizations. But I think that is a role that he's kind of been forced into, perhaps. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison for blocking the motorway. And I was at a protest this week in Amsterdam, and a question came up after it turned a little bit nasty. I was talking to my flatmate who I was at the protest with, and we were discussing whether we would be willing to protest if the consequences were our death or long-term imprisonment. We're in a privileged position here in Amsterdam, me and that flatmate in particular, because we have EU and Schengen passports. We can't be deported from Amsterdam. Our other flatmates would have liked to attend the protest, but they're here on visas with their British passports, and so they could risk a ban from the whole EU, as happened to my flatmate's sister, who is banned from the EU for 10 years for protesting in favour of Palestine in Greece. Wow. So we're in a privileged position there. And so I suppose the question is, my final question to you, what do we owe to people relative to our own security? And how can we determine what that level of acceptable risk is? I know that's not an easy question, and I don't think there's a clear and easy answer, but I would love to get some thoughts from you at this point.
I think that is an impossible question to answer because it would vary from person to person, and a person's sense of justice and a sense of risk and weighing that risk would differ. And it would differ for me as well. For example, in my life, I'm married to a British woman, and potentially we may move back one day. And if I had a kid but was still in the process of getting my British citizenship, that may cause me, who still does have a large sense of justice and a desire to go and protest, that would make me think twice if I was in that process, just for the sake of my family and being able to keep my family together. But for someone with less to lose, like last episode we spoke about students and why students are so important as the vanguard of protest, I think they have a chance to give a lot to society that hasn't necessarily given them a lot at this point. But I think when I think of my own place in the world, and I sit here in America, and I see that we, recently have re-elected Donald Trump, and I do feel a sense of guilt to that, even though I voted against him. And, the far right in my country is on the rise and has been on the rise for a while. And I feel a big sense of duty, not necessarily to my own community, even though I am trying to educate members of my community, but the U.S. is the imperial power of the world, and I feel a sense of guilt to my many friends I have around the world that they do not have a say in what this imperialist power does and what will affect them, or the people of indigenous communities around the world who American corporations continuously exploit. I do feel a sense of responsibility for that because I wish there was more I could do in my own society. And if more people, I think, had that sense of responsibility with their vote. I know plenty of people that don't even pay attention to politics here and don't feel a sense of responsibility. And it infuriates me because they have the keys in their hand, in theory. I mean, in theory, they have the keys in their hand to the imperialist powers that is ruling the world right now. And I have so many friends that would do a much better job with those keys,
I know what you mean. I think that it's tempting to feel like you can always do more, you can always do more, you can always do more. And to an extent, that's true, but it is an unhelpful line of thinking, right? I think that the quote that comes to mind that best summarizes that idea and the responsibility that we have in this area is from the man himself, Mr. Karl Marx, which is from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, right? You do what you can for those who can't. And I think that on that note of having people who in your life who self-describe them as selves as non-political, maybe they feel disengaged or disconnected from politics, maybe they feel disenfranchised, maybe it's just complicated and they don't really understand how it works and they don't know how to do it. I think that one of the most important things for people on the left to try and communicate to the people in their lives is that everything is political. Every action you take, every piece of media you consume, every response you have, everything is political in some way.
I could not agree with you more, and I've had that discussion with many people over the past few months as the election was coming up in the States. And I know several couples where one person is MAGA and the other person is a liberal. Wow. And in my head, I don't understand how that works because politics is the manifestation of what you idealize the world to be. So if that is in a strong disagreement with your partner, I don't understand how you can be a couple.
I agree. I could never be in a relationship with a conservative, and some people, usually conservatives, judge me for that, but I think it says so much about your values. Like, I think your political alignment is your values turned into a sort of practical outward expression in many ways.
Exactly.
Well, I think that that's something to keep in mind for the long term. I think we've covered quite a lot in this episode. I think the theme that I'm noticing starting to emerge in these episodes is that your episodes where you do the research are sort of a bit more structured with a bit more of like a clear goal, and mine is a little bit more meandering.
I really enjoyed this discussion a lot, and you have successfully pushed me towards sympathizing with Just Stop Oill. So you did succeed in that in this short time frame. And I hope that other people can at least see the historical framework they're working within, whether they agree with it or not. And maybe their legitimacy will be raised a little bit in some people's minds, or at the very least, the cause they are fighting for will seem more urgent.
I'm glad that I was able to have that impact on you. And actually, just before we do go, something that I wanted to revisit that was mentioned up at the top. I don't have a lot of clear sort of sources, evidence backing this up. It was something that I read in an internet comment like an hour before we were going to start to record, and I didn't have time to research properly. But someone pointed out that comparing these disruptive actions to, for example, civil disobedience in the US civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was, in addition to doing these disruptive actions, also working to get people registered to vote, to put pressure on local politicians to do this, that, and the other. And I do think that is something that is maybe lacking from the protest movement. I think that the protest itself is all well and good and very important for gaining attention, for putting pressure on governments. But I think that reaching out to communities and getting people to engage with politics themselves is perhaps an even more important side of that.
Absolutely. Things like letter writing campaigns to MPs or congressmen, while old school, I think do have some effect, at least, in at least helping politicians remember that in theory they do work for you. And if there are a lot of people putting pressure from one side, then maybe that will be something to consider in the re-election campaign.
Yeah, and I've only ever written a letter to an MP once. I don't remember what it was about. It was something anti-Brexit related. But it's kind of fun because you get a letter back and it's got like the stamp of Parliament on it and it's on nice paper and it looks really official. So yeah, I think that can entice people. It's just a fun thing to get, is a letter from a politician.
I wrote to an MP when I was living in the UK.
Yeah?
And it was about the Super League.
Well, I think that's all stuff to keep in mind and important to remember as you go into your communities. I think it would be nice to conclude with a quote that effectively sums up my view on disruptive protests which seem to annoy people, especially in the British press. It is a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his letter from a Birmingham jail.
First, I must confess that over the last few years, I've been gravely disappointed in the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically feels that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait until a more convenient season.
Thank you so much for listening, and keep fighting the good fight.
Thank you, sir.